The wind howled through the cottonwoods, turning the Montana hills into a frozen wasteland. Snowflakes bit like glass, and the air smelled of iron and old smoke. A lone figure trudged through the storm, Sarah McCullough, her dress stiff with grime, her boots leaking straw, like a scarecrow's guts. She didn't blink when the wind stole her breath. Folks in Rattlesnake Gulch called her the ash woman behind her back. Not that she cared. 3 years since the fire took her husband her cabin and the tiny grave behind the blackened oak. The towns she'd passed through had all given her the same treatment: doors, bolted eyes averted, as if grief were contagious. By the time she reached Silver Creek, her hands were raw as butcher's scraps. The general store's bell jingled like a bad joke when she entered. Old man Henderson, who'd once sold her husband a shovel, pretended to rearrange canned peaches. "Ain't hiring," he muttered before she could speak. Sarah's laugh surprised even her. "Funny. Didn't recall asking." She palmed a penny nail from his counter on her way out. Outside the church loomed like a tomb. She'd stopped praying after the fire, but the twins caught her eye, 2 scrawny girls huddled by the dry fountain, sharing a single moth-eaten blanket. Their mother folks whispered had run off with a gambler. Sarah crouched, her knees popping like gunshots. "You hungry?" The bolder one eyed her like a cornered fox. "Ain't supposed to talk to strangers." Sarah shrugged and tossed them the last of her jerky. "Smart kid. But strangers ain't always the worst thing." The wind shrieked agreement as she walked away, her shadow stretching long and sharp across the snow. Somewhere east, a train whistle blew. Sarah adjusted her shawl, not against the cold, but to hide the grin she hadn't felt in years. Turns out Rock Bottom makes a mighty fine starting place. The quieter twin, Josie, still clutched Sarah's hand like a lifeline, her thumb rubbing the rough calluses where a wedding band used to sit. June, the bolder one, kicked open the door wider with a theatrical flourish. "Pa don't talk much," she announced as if warning Sarah about a temperamental mule. "But he ain't mean. Just got his words burned out of him same as you did." The man, Elias McCullough, though no one introduced him, didn't move from his spot by the fire. A half-whittled horse figurine lay abandoned on the bench beside him, knife still wedged in the wood. His silence wasn't the empty kind Sarah had grown used to in towns full of pitying stares. This was the quiet of a man who'd run out of things to say years ago. She recognized it like a reflection. June dragged a stool over with a screech. "Sit. You smell like a wet coyote." Sarah barked a laugh before she could stop herself. The sound startled Joe Stieg into grinning, her front tooth chipped like a little rebel's badge. Elias's gaze flicked to Sarah's face, then to the penny nail she'd unconsciously been rolling between her fingers, the one she'd lifted from Henderson's store. His mouth twitched. Not a smile, more like a man acknowledging a fellow thief. Josie tugged Sarah toward the hearth. "You're colder than a banker's heart," she declared, pressing a chipped mug of broth into her hands. The heat seared Sarah's palms, but she didn't let go. June plopped onto the floor, peeling a potato, with more enthusiasm than skill. "We've been practicing proposals," she announced, tossing a mangled peel at her sister. "Josie says you gotta kneel, but I reckon a widow'd rather be asked straight." Sarah choked on her broth. Elias, damn him, didn't even blink, just reached over and thumped her back once hard enough to rattle her ribs. "Ain't no proposal happening," Sarah whised, wiping her mouth. June shrugged. "Yet." Outside, the wind howled through the cottonwoods, but the fire popped like gunfire, loud and alive. Sarah studied the carved animals on the shelf, a lopsided bear, a fox missing an ear, then the girls' expectant faces, and finally Elias's scarred hands, still gripping that knife. 3 years of walking, and here she was, in a house that leaned like a drunk cowboy, being courted by a pair of half-feral children, and a man who communicated in grunts and whittling. Funny thing about rock bottom, sometimes it's just the foundation of something wilder. Sarah set down the mug and plucked the knife from Elias's bench. "That horse's legs are crooked," she said, and started carving. Sarah woke to the scent of coffee, real coffee, not the burnt chicory she'd choked down for years. The cabin still held the night's chill, but someone had laid out a woolen shirt over the foot of her cot. Too big to be June's, too small to be Elias's. Probably belonged to his dead wife. The thought should have stung. Instead, she pulled it on the fabric, rough but warm, like a handshake from a stranger who didn't pity you. Out in the main room, so Colt. Because apparently Elias had been June's invention, like the bride nonsense was dumping oats into a pot. The girls were nowhere in sight. Sarah cleared her throat. "They've already fled the scene of the crime, He didn't turn. Chicken coop. Betting on which hen lays first." His voice was quieter than she expected, like he'd rationed his words the same way frontier folks rationed sugar. She picked up the tin cup he'd left for her. The coffee was black as a sinner's soul, and just as strong. "Christ almighty," she coughed. "You brew this with gunpowder." That got a reaction. A flicker at the corner of his mouth. "Keeps the wolves away." He slid a knife across the table toward her handle first. "Peel those apples. Girls like 'em fried with cinnamon." Sarah stared at the blade. Last man who'd handed her a knife had been her husband back when they'd still believed the land wouldn't break them. She picked it up. "You always this chatty at dawn, only when I'm being robbed." He nodded at her pocket, where the penny nail from Henderson's store still sat. "Busted?" Sarah grinned sharp as the knife in her hand. "Figured you for a man who'd respect a good theft." Outside, a shriek erupted June, probably losing her bet. Colt didn't flinch, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction. Sarah peeled the apple in one long spiral just to show off. The peel coiled on the table like a snake. Colt eyed it, then her. "You staying?" The question hung between them, simpler than a proposal, heavier than a confession. Somewhere past the window, Josie crowed in victory. Sarah tossed the apple core into the fire. It hissed like a promise. "Long enough to teach those hellions how to bake bread," she said. "After that we'll see." Colt nodded, as if that settled everything. Maybe it did. The coffee still tasted like tar, but the warmth stayed. The blisters on Sarah's hands burst by sundown, staining Colt's hammer handle with specks of copper. She didn't complain, just wrapped them in strips of flour sack and kept working. June noticed first. "You're bleeding on our porch," she announced, as if Sarah were a poorly butchered deer. Colt looked up from the railing he was planing. His gaze lingered on Sarah's hands. Then he wordlessly pulled a flask from his coat and tossed it to her. "Whiskey's for drinking, not doctoring," Sarah said, but cracked it open anyway. The burn made her eyes water. Colt's mouth did that almost smile again. "Ain't whiskey." She sniffed the flask, willow bark and alcohol, bitter as regret. "Your wife's recipe. Yours now." He said it like a fact, not a gift, and went back to hammering. That night, the girls talked her into teaching them how to make sourdough. Josie kneaded dough like she was wrestling a badger, while June kept stealing pinches to sculpt tiny lopsided animals. "Make a bear," June demanded, shoving a floury lump at Sarah. Like the one on the shelf, Sarah froze. The carved bear had been the first thing she'd noticed when she stumbled into this half-cocked family. Colt's knife stilled on the other side of the table. Josie, blissfully oblivious, piped up, "Mama made that one." "Papa carves the legs wrong now." A muscle jumped in Colt's jaw. Sarah expected him to bolt like a spooked horse. Instead, he reached over and plucked the dough from June's hands. "Bear's got 5 claws. Not 3, he muttered, shaping the blob with surprising gentleness. June gaped. You never show us, never asked. Sarah watched him work those scarred, quiet hands, creating something alive from nothing. She'd seen men build fences, dig graves, even stitch wounds, but never this. Never beauty for beauty's sake. Without thinking, she reached out and fixed the misshapen ear. Their fingers brushed. Colt didn't pull away. The moment shattered when June shoved her own doughy abomination between them. Now, make them kiss, Sarah choked. Colt dropped the bear. It landed with a splat, flattening into a grotesque pancake. Josie burst into giggles. June looked betrayed. You ruined it. Yep. Colt deadpanned, wiping his hands on his pants. Plumb tragic. Sarah couldn't help it. She laughed until her ribs ached. The sound startled everyone, including herself. Colt studied her like she'd grown a second head, then did the damnedest thing. He laughed too. Rough and unused, like a rusty hinge, forced open after years. Outside, the wind kicked up, howling through the cottonwoods. But inside, the fire burned steady. The dough rose slow. And for the first time in 3 winters, Sarah McCullough didn't feel like the ash woman. She felt like someone who might, against all odds, belong. The second cot in the girls' room stayed empty for exactly 3 nights. On the 4th, Sarah woke to the sound of splintering wood. She bolted upright, just as June came barreling into the room, eyes wild. Papa's hurt. Sarah didn't remember grabbing her boots. She hit the barn. At a dead run, Colt's name sharp in her throat, only to find him sitting on a hay bale, calmly wrapping a rag around his forearm, while Josie solemnly handed him nails, like a battlefield nurse. Blood seeped through the fabric, dark as old wine. Damn fool, spooked the mayor, he muttered before Sarah could ask. Got pinned against the stall. June tugged Sarah's sleeve. He won't let us help. Sarah snatched the rag from Colt's hands. The gash ran from wrist to elbow. Ugly, but clean. You're lucky it didn't hit bone, she snapped, pressing fresh linen against it. Colt hissed. Oh, don't be such a baby. You've had worse from shaving. That startled a laugh out of him, rough and surprised, like a coyote caught singing. The girls stared as if he'd grown antlers. Sarah worked in silence, stitching the wound with thread from her own sewing kit. Colt watched her hands, not the needle. You're good at this. Had practice. She tied the knot, tighter than necessary. My husband was the kind of man who considered bleeding a minor inconvenience. Colt's mouth quirked. Sounds familiar. The girls exchanged a look. June opened her mouth, no doubt, to say something disastrous, when Josie suddenly plopped onto Colt's good knee. Tell us about the scar, she demanded, poking his eyebrow. Sarah expected him to shut down. Instead, he sighed. Got kicked by a mule. Liar, June crowed. You always say that. Maybe I like my lies better than the truth. He glanced at Sarah just for a second, but it was enough. Later, when the girls were asleep and the lanterns burned low, Sarah found Colt on the porch, whittling one-handed. She handed him a whiskey-laced coffee. Mule, huh? He took the cup. Their fingers brushed. Union sharpshooter at Vicksburg. The admission hung between them, heavier than the night air. Sarah sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. You don't talk much about before. Neither do you. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent as ever. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. Sarah took a sip from her own cup. My husband built our barn in a day. Didn't measure twice. Whole damn thing collapsed in the first snow. She hadn't meant to say it. The words just tumbled out, sharp and laughing and aching all at once. Colt's shoulder pressed against hers. Sounds like an idiot. He was. Sarah grinned into the dark. God, he really was. The next morning, she found the empty cot, dismantled its boards, repurposed into a new bookshelf for the girls. Colt said nothing when she moved her things into his room, just handed her a nail and pointed to where the last shelf needed bracing. Funny thing about silence. Sometimes it's not empty at all. Sometimes it's full of everything you don't need words for. The chipped button in Sarah's pocket felt heavier than a stone as she pinned Colt's shirts to the line. Spring had turned the yard to mud, but the girls didn't care. They splashed through puddles, their laughter sharp as birdsong. June waved a straw doll at Sarah. She's called Widowmaker. Like your horse stories? Sarah nearly dropped the clothespin. Colt's stories, not hers. The man hadn't spoken 10 words about his cavalry days, but June had apparently been collecting them like arrowheads. The wind shifted, carrying voices from the road. 3 women from town. Mrs. Tibbet's sewing circle no doubt lingered by the fence. Their bonnets bobbed like vultures circling. Sarah kept hanging laundry, her movements deliberate. Let them look. Josie suddenly appeared at her side, mud up to her knees. They're talking about you. Her whisper carried the terrible clarity of children who haven't learned to lie. I know, sugar. June marched up to the fence, planting her feet like a tiny gunslinger. Y'all lost. Mrs. Henderson's smile could have curdled milk. Just admiring your household? Her gaze slid to Sarah. Such an interesting arrangement. Colt chose that moment to step out of the barn axe, balanced on his shoulder. The women stiffened. He didn't greet them, just walked to Sarah's side and handed her a fresh peg without breaking stride. Mrs. Tibbet found her voice. Colton McCrae, surely you. He surely doesn't care. Sarah finished snapping a sheet so hard it popped like gunfire. The women flinched. That evening, Sarah found June by the creek, furiously braiding grass into a rope. Making a noose for busybodies, the girl announced. Sarah choked on her coffee. Colt, damn him, didn't even look up from his whittling. But later, when the moon rose, he appeared beside Sarah at the wash basin. Ride with me tomorrow. Where? Church. The word landed between them like a challenge. Sarah's hands stilled in the soapy water. Colt never went to town. On Sundays, claimed sermons gave him hives. He picked up a dish towel, his scarred fingers careful with the china. Figured it's time they hear your name from my mouth. His voice was rough, but his eyes were steady. All proper like. Sarah's throat tightened. This quiet man, with his quiet ways, offering battle in the only language he knew. She reached for his hand, soap bubbles glistening between their fingers. You sure? Once those old biddies see you claim me, there's no good. He interrupted, squeezing her hand hard enough to wake. Let 'em talk. Outside, the girls whooped as they chased fireflies, their shadows long and wild in the gathering dark. Sarah leaned into Colt's shoulder, the wood smoke and sweat scent of him, as familiar now as her own heartbeat. Come morning, they'd ride into town together. Let the gossips choke on their whispers. Some things, like spring after winter, like scars that heal crooked, like love that comes unasked, weren't meant to be tidy, and that was just fine. The lantern hinge creaked under Colt's fingers, the sound stretching like the silence between them. Sarah watched his hands, those steady, scarred hands that could gentle a spooked horse or stitch a wound, but couldn't seem to shape the words she needed to hear. Then, without looking up, he reached into his pocket and slid something across the porch railing toward her. A ring. Simple, unpolished, likely hammered from a silver coin. Found it in my mother's trunk, he muttered. Figured it might fit you. Sarah's breath caught. The metal was warm from his pocket. This your idea of a proposal, McCrae? Because if so, it's the worst one I've of. Not a proposal. Colt finally met her eyes, his gaze darker than the coming night. A claim. The word hung between them raw as a fresh brand. Somewhere in the barn, one of the girls who draw dolls, Widowmaker, no doubt toppled over with a sound like distant gunfire. Sarah turned the ring in her fingers. You want to march into town tomorrow and shut them all up? Is that it? Colt's thumb brushed the hinge grease from his palms. I want to wake up knowing you won't bolt when the girls call you Mama. The honesty of it hit her like a buckboard at full speed. She'd expected gruffness, maybe even anger, not this quiet, terrifying vulnerability. A sudden crash came from inside the house, followed by June's indignant shriek. "Josie, you idiot! That was my best rock." Colt didn't even flinch, just raised an eyebrow at Sarah. Last chance to run. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been waiting for her. "Oh, I'm staying," she said, grinning, as another crash shook the walls. Somebody's got to teach those little savages how to throw a proper punch. The next morning they rode into town together, Colt stiff in his one good shirt, Sarah with the ring gleaming on her hand, the girls trailing behind on their stubborn pony. Mrs. Tibbet's mouth puckered like she'd bitten into a green persimmon when she saw it. Sheriff Vernon tipped his hat. "Morning, Mrs. McCrae." The emphasis made Sarah's chest tighten. Not with fear, but with something fiercer. Pride, maybe. Or possession. June, of course, ruined the moment by shouting, "Can we get candy now?" Mama promised. Colt's hand found Sarah's calluses, catching on silver. The gossip's whispers rose around them like dust devils. But for once, Sarah didn't hear a single word. Some things, it turned out, didn't need to be earned. They just needed to be claimed. The storm hit, like a drunken cowboy kicking in a saloon door. One moment the sky was pale. The next, it was spitting hail the size of marbles. Sarah barely had time to snatch the laundry before a gust sent the line snapping like a gunshot. Inside the barn, June was conducting a full-scale evacuation of her treasures. A cracked teacup, 3 chicken feathers, and what appeared to be a petrified biscuit, while Josie solemnly informed the terrified hens that they'd be safe if they just stopped being such cowards. Colt appeared in the doorway, water streaming off his hat. "Roof's holding, for now." Sarah wrung out her skirts. "Remind me why we live in Montana again." Freezing builds character. He reached past her to steady a shuddering rafter, his sleeve brushing her shoulder. The contact lingered a heartbeat too long. A particularly vicious hailstone shattered against the barn door. June gasped. "It's the devil's teeth, or God's gravel," Sarah countered, which sent the girls into fits of giggles. Even Colt's mouth twitched. Then the wind changed. A sound like a dying moose cut through the storm, the distinct groan of wood under pressure. Colt was moving before Sarah could blink, shoving her and the girls toward the grain barrels. The hayloft collapsed seconds later, burying the spot where they'd just stood, under a mountain of splintered lumber and old hay. Silence. Then Josie piped up, "Well." That was exciting. Sarah's hands shook as she checked the girls for injuries. Colt's gaze burned into her dark, with something she couldn't name. Fear, anger, both. June dusted hay from her hair. "Can we sleep in the house tonight? In case God throws more rocks." That night, with the storm still howling outside, they bedded down by the hearth, the girls curled like commas in their pallet, Colton and Sarah, sitting back to back, against the weight of the unspoken. The fire popped. Somewhere a shutter banged. Sarah traced the whittled bird's crooked wing. "You knew that beam was weak." Colt stiffened. "Knew it wouldn't last another winter. And you didn't fix it because I figured if it held, we'd stay. If it didn't." His voice roughened. "Maybe you'd run." The admission hung between them raw as the storm outside. Sarah turned to face him. In the firelight, his scar looked less like damage and more like a map, a path she suddenly needed to follow. She reached for his hand, pressing the wooden bird into his palm. "Fix the damn barn, Colt. We're not going anywhere." Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the girls murmured in their sleep. And for the first time since the fire that took her old life, Sarah realized something terrifying and wonderful. She was already home. The fire popped, sending up a spark that danced dangerously close to Sarah's drying skirts. She didn't move to brush it away, just watched it burn out against the damp wool leaving behind the faintest scorch mark. A fitting metaphor for her life these days. Colt appeared beside her, 2 tin cups in hand. The whiskey inside smelled like poor decisions and good intentions. He handed her one without a word. Sarah took a sip, wincing enough as it burned its way down. If I'd known motherhood involved this much running through blizzards, I'd have lied better about your cooking skills. Colt finished, the ghost of a smirk in his voice. She kicked him lightly with her still damp boot. I was going to say, stolen a faster horse. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters like a drunk trying to pick a lock. Inside, the girls slept in a tangle of limbs and quilts, Josie's fist still clutching Sarah's sleeve, even in sleep. Colt studied the fire. You could have died out there. So could she. He turned the cup in his hands. You didn't hesitate. Sarah stared into her whiskey. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have braved a light drizzle for anyone. Now, she'd marched into a whiteout for a child who wasn't even hers. When did that happen? The answer came with painful clarity. The moment Josie had drawn that stick figure with buttons for a heart, a log shifted in the hearth, sending up a shower of sparks. Colt's shoulder pressed against hers, solid as an oak root. Neither of them moved away. You know, Sarah mused, Mrs. Tibbetts, probably writing my obituary right now. Stranger dies in foolish attempt at heroism. Services pending. Casseroles welcome. Colt snorted. She'd charge folks to read it. They drank in comfortable silence, the storm raging beyond the walls. Somewhere around midnight, June sleepily lifted her head. Mama Sarah. The title hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's throat tightened. Colt went very still. Yeah, sugar. June yawned. Next time it snows, can we lose something together? Sarah burst out laughing. Colt's shoulders shook with silent mirth. Outside, the wind screamed its frustration at being left out of the joke. Deal, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. But we're taking the damn lantern. Colt's hand found hers, under the quilt, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. No ring, no promises, just 2 survivors, a couple of half-wild children, and a fire that refused to go out. Come morning, there'd be fences to mend, and a barn to rebuild. There'd be townsfolk to scandalize, and probably another storm brewing on the horizon. But for now, for this single stolen moment, the world was warm enough, and that, Sarah decided, as she leaned into Colt's shoulder, was more than she'd ever dared hope for. The axe in Colt's hands gleamed like a smile in the afternoon sun. Hiram Bloss shifted in his saddle, suddenly finding the mud on his boots fascinating. His 2 lackeys boys, who hadn't yet grown into their Adam's apples, exchanged nervous glances. Sarah draped the quilt over the porch rail with deliberate calm. Civic responsibility. Her voice carried the sweet, deadly tone of honey laced with arsenic. Funny. I don't recall electing you town mayor, Hiram. Or is that another title you just appropriated? One of the boys snickered. Hiram's ears turned red. This ain't about politics. It's about decency. He jabbed a finger at the house. Those girls need proper raising, not some. The screen door slammed. June marched onto the porch, Josie trailing behind, clutching her button bracelet like a weapon. We got perfect raising, June announced. Mama Sarah lets us cuss on Tuesdays. Colt choked. Sarah bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. Hiram sputtered. That's exactly what And we ain't even started on the blasphemy lessons, June continued cheerfully, while Josie nodded with grave solemnity. Colt chose that moment to step forward, hefting the axe onto his shoulder. The blade caught the light. You were saying, Hiram. The man's horse sidestepped nervously. This ain't over, McCrae. Oh, I think it is. Sarah descended the porch steps, her skirts swirling in the mud. She stopped just shy of Hiram's stirrup and looked up with a smile that would have frozen hell. Unless you'd like to explain to the actual sheriff Why, you're harassing a war widow and two orphans. Hiram's mouth opened, closed. Colt's axe twitched. The retreat was less a dignified exit and more a panicked scramble, horses slipping in the muck as the men fled down the lane. June whooped and fired an imaginary pistol after them. Colt's hand found the small of Sarah's back, warm even through her dress. Blasphemy lessons. She leaned into his touch. Wait till you see what I've got planned for Sundays. That night, with the girls asleep and the house quiet, Sarah stood at the mantel, turning the warped wedding band in her fingers. Colt's box sat open beside it. The locket, the ribbon, June's backwards letters, declaring her name, stayed. Colt appeared in the doorway, his silhouette broad against the firelight. You know, he said slowly, there's a third option. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Between wife and helper. He crossed the room, stopping just close enough that she could smell wood smoke and sweat. Partner. Outside, the first frogs of spring sang in the creek. Somewhere in the dark, a new calf bawled for its mother. Sarah slid the ruined ring back into her satchel and reached for Colt's hand. Took you long enough to ask, she muttered, but her fingers laced tight with his. And, when June's voice piped up from the hallway, does this mean we get cake? Sarah didn't even pretend to be surprised. She just sighed and squeezed Colt's hand, because some things, it turned out, were inevitable, like spring after winter, like love after loss, like family, however strangely it came together. The moment Hiram's horse disappeared around the bend, Sarah's knees gave out. She didn't collapse, just sat down hard in the mud, her skirts blooming around her like a dark flower. Colt was beside her in an instant, his calloused hand gripping her shoulder. You okay? Sarah stared at the locket in her palm, the tiny portrait of her first husband staring back. I think I just declared war on the entire territory. Colt's thumb brushed her collarbone. War's kinder than what you gave Hiram. A giggle erupted from the porch. June and Josie crouched behind the railing, their eyes wide with admiration. You called him a stain, June whispered reverently. Josie nodded. Like pea on trousers. Sarah burst out laughing, the sound raw and startled. Colt's shoulders shook silently beside her. The screen door banged open. Mrs. Tibbet stood there, of all people, holding a pie. The old woman took in the scene, Sarah sitting in the mud, Colt's hand on her shoulder, the girls grinning like bandits, and sniffed. Brought you a blackberry. Figured you could use the sugar after running off them fools. Sarah gaped. Mrs. Tibbet set the pie on the porch rail with a thud. Don't look so shocked. Even old biddies get tired of men telling folks how to live. She turned to leave, then paused. Though if you do decide to make things official, the church social's next Sunday. Just saying. The moment Mrs. Tibbet's wagon rattled away, June pounced on the pie. Does this mean we win? Colt helped Sarah to her feet, his grip lingering at her waist. Means we get pie. That night, with the girls asleep and the last crumbs cleared, Sarah stood at the bedroom window, watching the moon rise over the McCrae land. Colt's land. Their land, if she dared claim it. Colt appeared behind her, close enough that his breath stirred her hair. You thinking about Hiram? No. She turned, pressing the locket into his palm. I'm thinking about burning the past, so the future has room to grow. His fingers closed around the tiny portrait. You sure? Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out June's misspelled name, Marble, with its balloon-like B. Some things are worth keeping. The rest. She took the locket back and set it on the dresser. Let the dead bury the dead. Colt's kiss was slow and sweet-tasting of blackberries. And tomorrow. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawed earth and new grass. And if Sarah McCrae, because that's who she was now, who she'd chosen to be, happened to kick the warped wedding band under the bed, where it belonged, well, some revolutions were quieter than others. The apron pockets still smelled of Mary's lavender sachet, when Sarah thrust her hands into them. That afternoon, kneading dough with more force than necessary, June watched from the table chin, propped on flour-dusted fists. "You're mad baking," she observed. Sarah snorted. "I'm what? Mad baking. Like when Pa fixes the fence too straight." After Hiram visits, June popped a stolen raisin in her mouth. "It means you care." Outside, Colt's hammer rang against the new barn door, each strike precise, angry, and somehow hopeful. Sarah wiped her hands and peered out the window. The man was shirtless, in the spring sun, sweat glistening on the scar that ran down his ribs like a lightning bolt. June followed her gaze. "He's pretty, ain't he? June McCrae." "What?" "He is." The girl grinned, unrepentant. "Josie says his nose looks like a— I don't want to know." Sarah shoved another lump of dough at her. "Here, knead your fantasies into this." The screen door slammed. Colt stood there breathing hard, wood shavings clinging to his chest hair. He took one look at the flour-covered kitchen and the giggling girls, then at Sarah's flushed face. "What did I miss?" "Nothing," Sarah said too quickly, while June crowed. "Sarah thinks you're—" A well-aimed raisin hit the girl's forehead. Colt's eyebrows climbed. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, then shattered when Josie wandered in, clutching a chicken upside down. "Can we have a wedding cake shaped like a pig?" Colt choked. Sarah buried her face in her hands. The chicken clucked indignantly. Later, when the stars came out and the girls finally slept, Colt found Sarah on the porch, her bare feet propped on the rail. He handed her a whiskey, the good stuff saved for rare occasions. "To irregular things," he murmured, clinking his glass against hers. Sarah took a sip, letting the burn settle in her chest. "You realize we're raising miniature outlaws, don't you?" Colt's laugh was low and warm. "Better than raising cowards." The wind carried the scent of turned earth and apple blossoms from the gnarled tree by the creek. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote yipped. Sarah leaned into Colt's shoulder, the worn fabric of his shirt rough against her cheek. "Hiram'll be back," he said quietly. "Let him." She turned her face into Colt's neck, breathing in sweat and wood smoke and home. "I've got everything I need right here." And when Colt's hand found hers in the dark, his fingers twining through hers like roots through good soil, Sarah knew deep in her bones, where the ashes used to live, that some fires didn't destroy. They forged.